Each day we're confronted with the grim realities of the world we live in, witnessing acts of harm that defy comprehension. It's a painful truth of existence, yet one we cannot overlook. As someone who delves deep into the realm of criminal behavior, I'm here to bring you the most jaw-dropping accounts and explore what compels individuals to commit such acts. My name is Daniel, and I've got an unbelievable crime story to share with you. In the peaceful town of Briarwood, Alabama, the days were marked by the hum of cicadas in the summer and the soft rustle of oak trees in the breeze. Here, life moved slowly, and neighbors exchanged friendly waves as they passed each other on quiet streets. It was the kind of place where everyone seemed to know each other, and trust came easily. At the center of this charming town lived Sarah Bennett, a vibrant 19-year-old with big dreams and a passion for photography. To those who knew her, Sarah wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was a spark, a force of creativity and kindness that seemed to leave an impression wherever she went. Sarah was no ordinary college freshman. She had a gift, an eye for capturing the world through her camera lens in ways others might overlook. From the quiet beauty of Briarwood's rolling hills to the fleeting smiles of its people, Sarah's photography told stories that words could never express. Her dream was to someday open a studio, a space where her passion could thrive and inspire others. Sarah's close bond with her mother, Maggie, was the heart of her life. As a single mother, Maggie had worked tirelessly to give Sarah every opportunity to succeed. Their relationship was built on more than love. It was rooted in respect, trust, and a shared determination to rise above life's challenges. They were more than mother and daughter. They were best friends. Sarah's boyfriend, Jake Miller, was the kind of guy parents hoped their daughters would bring home. Handsome and charming, he had an easygoing personality that made him popular with everyone in Briarwood. As the star quarterback of the high school football team, Jake was the town's golden boy, the one who could do no wrong. To the outside world, Sarah and Jake were the picture-perfect couple. What no one in Briarwood knew, what even Jake couldn't see, was that Sarah was beginning to pull away. Behind her bright smile and polite demeanor, she felt a growing unease in their relationship. Jake's affection had started to feel more like control, his attention overwhelming rather than comforting. It was a subtle shift, one that Sarah struggled to put into words, but it weighed heavily on her. Jake's devotion to Sarah seemed unwavering, but to her, it was becoming stifling. He would show up unannounced, text her constantly, and expect her to prioritize him above everything else. Sarah began to confide in Emily more frequently, expressing her doubts and fears. Still, she tried to convince herself that Jake's behavior was normal, that he cared for her deeply and only wanted the best for them. Sarah was at a crossroads in her life. With her first year of college ahead of her, she felt torn between the person she was becoming and the life Jake seemed to expect of her. She didn't want to hurt him, but she also couldn't ignore the small voice inside her that urged her to break free and follow her own path. In Briarwood, appearances were everything. To the outside world, Sarah Bennett seemed to have it all: talent, love, and a future brimming with possibility. But behind closed doors, her doubts were growing, and as the summer wore on, a new question began to emerge, one that no one could answer. Was Sarah's unease just a fleeting feeling, or was it something far more dangerous, waiting to surface? October 17th, 1999 began like any other day in Briarwood. The air carried the crispness of early fall, and the town moved at its usual pace. For Maggie Bennett, the evening promised nothing out of the ordinary. Her daughter Sarah had texted earlier, mentioning plans to meet Jake at the local diner. Maggie didn't think twice about it. Sarah's text read simply, "Heading to the diner with Jake. Be home soon. Love you, Mom." It was a message Maggie would replay in her mind countless times in the days to come. At first, there was nothing unusual about Sarah not being home immediately. Maggie, seated in her favorite chair, glanced at the clock as it approached 10 p.m. Sarah wasn't one to stay out too late, but she was a college freshman after all. Maybe she and Jake had stopped to talk somewhere, or perhaps she'd lost track of time. Maggie tried to push aside the gnawing feeling in her gut. By 11 p.m., that feeling had grown into unease. Maggie dialed Sarah's number, but it went straight to voicemail. She told herself the phone was probably out of battery. It had happened before. But when midnight struck, worry turned into dread. Maggie's maternal instinct screamed that something was wrong. Desperate for answers, Maggie called Jake's number. He answered after a few rings, his voice calm if slightly groggy. When she asked where Sarah was, Jake claimed he had dropped her off at home around 10:30 p.m. She said she had some studying to do, he explained, his tone matter-of-fact. Maggie pressed him, but he insisted that was all he knew. She wanted to believe him. Jake was Sarah's boyfriend, someone she trusted. But something about his explanation felt off. Maggie began calling Sarah's friends, each conversation more desperate than the last. No one had seen her, no one had heard from her. By dawn, Maggie hadn't slept a minute, pacing the house as she called the police. She explained that her daughter was missing, that Sarah would never disappear without a word, but her pleas were met with indifference. "She's 19, ma'am," the officer told her. "She's an adult. Are you sure she didn't just go off with friends, or need some space?" Maggie's voice trembled with frustration as she replied, "She wouldn't do that. Something's happened to her. I know it." The police, however, were unmoved. They promised to keep an eye out but made no immediate moves. For them, Sarah Bennett was just another young adult who had likely chosen to leave for a while. But Maggie knew her daughter better than anyone. This wasn't normal. This wasn't Sarah. As the hours dragged on, Maggie took matters into her own hands. She drove to the diner where Sarah had planned to meet Jake, questioning the employees and patrons. A waitress remembered seeing them. They were sitting in a booth, she said. Looked like they were arguing. She left with him, though, got in his car. A customer chimed in, recalling the way Sarah had seemed distracted, almost distant, as Jake spoke animatedly. The pieces didn't make sense. Why would Sarah leave with Jake if she'd felt so uneasy? And why wasn't she home now? Maggie's next stop was Jake's house. When he opened the door, he looked disheveled, his hair messy and his expression defensive. She asked him again what had happened the night before, and his answer didn't waver. "I dropped her off, Mrs. Bennett. I swear. She wanted to be alone." But Maggie wasn't convinced. There was something in his demeanor, a hesitation, a lack of urgency, that didn't sit right with her. She left his house with more questions than answers, her worry now bordering on panic. By the second day of Sarah's disappearance, word had spread across Briarwood. In a town where everyone knew each other, the news of her absence sent ripples of fear through the community. Friends and neighbors began organizing search parties, combing through wooded areas and back roads. But there was no sign of Sarah. Meanwhile, Maggie continued to push the police to take her daughter's case seriously. Her determination finally paid off when they agreed to open a missing persons investigation. Officers began retracing Sarah's last known steps, starting with Jake. He was brought in for questioning, and his story remained consistent. They had dinner at the diner, argued a bit, and he dropped her off at her house. But as investigators pressed him for details, inconsistencies began to emerge. Jake couldn't recall what Sarah was wearing that night, nor could he explain why his timeline didn't align with witness statements. Surveillance footage from the diner parking lot showed Jake's car pulling out around 9:45 p.m., but it was unclear whether Sarah had been with him. And then there was the issue of Sarah's phone. It hadn't been used since her text to Maggie earlier that evening. Each new detail added to the growing tension. The more the police uncovered, the less convincing Jake's story became. As the investigation gained traction, Maggie found herself caught in a whirlwind of emotions. She oscillated between hope and despair, clinging to the belief that her daughter was still alive, but unable to shake the growing fear that something terrible had happened. Every passing hour felt like an eternity, and every unanswered question only deepened the sense of helplessness that had taken hold of her. For the town of Briarwood, Sarah's disappearance became an unsettling reminder that even in the most peaceful places, darkness can take root. And for Maggie, it marked the beginning of a nightmare she could never have imagined, a relentless search for answers that would test her resolve and uncover truths she was not prepared to face. The town of Briarwood, shaken by Sarah Bennett's disappearance, banded together in an unprecedented way. Volunteers gathered daily to search the nearby woods, abandoned buildings, and the edges of highways, calling out Sarah's name as if their voices alone could bring her back. Flyers bearing Sarah's smiling face were plastered on storefronts and telephone poles. The local diner, the last known place Sarah was seen, became a hub for whispered theories and growing unease. But as the search intensified, so did the mystery surrounding Sarah's life. Days after Sarah's disappearance, her best friend Emily arrived at the Bennett house, her face pale and her hands trembling. Maggie, exhausted but determined, ushered her inside. Emily hesitated before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think it was important before," Emily said, her eyes filling with tears. "But Sarah, she'd been confiding in me about Jake. She felt like he was controlling her. She said she was starting to feel trapped." Maggie's heart sank. Sarah had never mentioned this to her. Jake had always seemed so charming, so devoted. But now, hearing Emily's words, pieces of Sarah's recent behavior began to fall into place. The hesitation in her voice when Jake's name came up, the way she seemed to avoid his touch. Maggie's mind raced with questions. Why hadn't Sarah told her? And what had Jake done to make her feel this way? Emily's revelations didn't stop there. She explained that Sarah had been receiving anonymous text messages in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. The messages were strange. Cryptic phrases like, "I'm watching you," and "you can't hide." At first, Sarah had dismissed them as a cruel prank, but as they continued, she grew uneasy. Emily showed Maggie a screenshot of one of the texts Sarah had forwarded to her. It read, "You're not as safe as you think." Maggie's hands shook as she held Emily's phone. She couldn't comprehend why Sarah hadn't come to her with this. Had her daughter been scared? Maggie immediately brought this information to the police. It was the first real lead they had, and it painted a shocking picture. If someone had been following Sarah, could they have been watching her that night? Could they have been the one to make her disappear? As investigators combed through Sarah's room, they came across something that deepened the mystery further. Her camera. Sarah's photography had always been a window into her world, a way she processed her thoughts and experiences. Her camera, tucked away in a drawer, seemed untouched since the night she vanished. When investigators reviewed the photos, most were ordinary images of sunsets, candid shots of her friends, and a few portraits of Jake. But toward the end of the memory card, the photos took a darker turn. One series of images stood out. They showed Sarah's car, parked on a quiet street at dusk. In the background of one photo, partially obscured by shadows, was a man. The man wasn't familiar to Maggie or Emily. He wore a dark hoodie, his face partially turned toward the camera. But in the final photo, taken just seconds later, he was fully visible. His eyes stared directly into the lens, as if he knew Sarah was watching him. The look on his face was unnerving, not angry, not frightened, but deliberate, as though he wanted her to know he was there. The discovery of the photos sent a ripple of urgency through the investigation. Who was this man? Why was he near Sarah's car? And was he connected to the anonymous messages she had been receiving? The police circulated the images, hoping someone in Briarwood would recognize the man. As the days passed, leads trickled in, but none panned out. Some claimed to have seen the man near the diner that night, while others thought they had spotted him weeks earlier, near Sarah's college campus. But no one could provide a name or a concrete connection. Meanwhile, suspicion around Jake continued to grow. His alibi had already begun to crumble under scrutiny, and now, with Sarah's best friend revealing that Sarah felt trapped in their relationship, the focus on him intensified. But Jake, maintaining his calm exterior, denied any involvement. He insisted he had dropped Sarah off at her house and knew nothing about the texts or the man in the photos. As investigators dug deeper into Sarah's life, they discovered a side of her that few people in Briarwood had known. Sarah, it seemed, had been struggling with more than just her relationship with Jake. Friends from her college revealed that Sarah had confided in them about feeling overwhelmed by school, by her relationship, and by a growing sense that she was being watched. One friend recalled a conversation Sarah had just weeks before her disappearance. "She told me she felt like someone was following her," the friend said. "She laughed it off, but I could tell it was really bothering her." These revelations painted a picture of a young woman grappling with fear and uncertainty, a stark contrast to the confident, cheerful Sarah that most people in Briarwood knew. But they also raised more questions than they answered. Who was watching Sarah? Was it someone she knew? And how did it all connect to her disappearance? As the community continued to rally around Maggie, the search for Sarah became more desperate. Volunteers expanded their efforts, scouring areas miles outside of town. The police began piecing together a timeline, trying to determine where Sarah might have gone after leaving the diner. But with every passing day, hope began to wane. The discovery of Sarah's camera and the unsettling photos it contained marked a turning point in the investigation. For Maggie, it was a reminder of her daughter's courage. Sarah had faced her fears head-on, documenting the very thing that had frightened her, but it was also a stark reminder of how little she had truly known about the dangers Sarah had been facing. In Briarwood, the image of Sarah Bennett as a carefree, ambitious young woman began to shift. The Sarah the world had known was just one part of her story. Beneath the surface was a young woman navigating fear, doubt, and the weight of secrets she had kept hidden. And as the investigation continued, it became clear that those secrets held the key to uncovering the truth about what had happened on the night she vanished. As the days turned into weeks, the search for Sarah Bennett intensified, and so did the scrutiny on Jake Miller. His story had remained consistent. He had dinner with Sarah, they argued, and he dropped her off at home around 10:30 p.m. But something about his calm demeanor and lack of urgency continued to unsettle investigators. The pressure mounted when new evidence came to light, evidence that directly contradicted his version of events. Surveillance footage obtained from a gas station near the diner painted a different picture of the night Sarah vanished. The grainy video showed Jake's car pulling out of the diner parking lot at 9:45 p.m., much earlier than he had claimed. More importantly, the passenger seat was visibly empty. Jake had been alone. Investigators confronted Jake with the footage, hoping he would offer an explanation. Instead, he doubled down, insisting he had dropped Sarah off at her house. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice steady. "She was in the car with me. Maybe the camera angle just didn't catch her?" But the footage didn't lie. And as the cracks in Jake's alibi grew wider, so did the suspicions surrounding him. Investigators began re-examining every detail of his story, looking for more inconsistencies. They questioned his friends, his family, and his co-workers, piecing together a timeline of his movements that night. The more they dug, the more their doubts deepened. At the same time, the photos from Sarah's camera led to a significant breakthrough. After circulating the images, police received a tip from a local shop owner who recognized the man in the background. His name was Mark Johnson, a 35-year-old mechanic who lived just outside of town. Mark had a criminal record: petty theft, vandalism, and a short stint in prison for assault. But what caught investigators' attention was his connection to Briarwood. Mark had been spotted near Sarah's house on multiple occasions in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Neighbors reported seeing him loitering on the street, sometimes sitting in his truck for hours at a time. When police brought Mark in for questioning, he denied any involvement in Sarah's disappearance. "I don't know the girl," he said, his voice defensive. "I've never even talked to her." But when confronted with the photos, his demeanor shifted. He admitted to being near Sarah's car, but claimed it wasn't what it looked like. Mark's explanation was as strange as it was unsettling. He claimed he had been hired to follow Sarah. According to him, a man had approached him weeks earlier, offering cash in exchange for surveillance. "It was just a job," Mark insisted. "He wanted me to keep an eye on her, take note of where she went, who she talked to. That's it. I didn't know she disappeared." When asked who had hired him, Mark hesitated. He claimed he didn't know the man's name, describing him only as someone well-dressed and quiet. Investigators pressed him for details, but his answers were vague. He maintained that his involvement ended with the surveillance, and that he had no knowledge of what happened to Sarah after that. Mark's claims raised more questions than answers. Who had hired him? Why was Sarah being followed? And how did it all connect to her disappearance? While Mark's account added a new layer of complexity to the case, it also cast a shadow of doubt over Jake. Could Jake have been the one who hired Mark? And if so, why? Jake's parents, sensing the mounting pressure on their son, stepped in. They hired a high-profile legal team to represent him, a move that sent shockwaves through the small town. Briarwood, once united in its search for Sarah, began to fracture. Some residents defended Jake, insisting he was incapable of harming Sarah. Others, however, pointed to the evidence mounting against him and questioned his parents' motives. With Jake's lawyers involved, the investigation took on a new level of intensity. His legal team immediately pushed back against the police, accusing them of targeting Jake without sufficient evidence. They dismissed the surveillance footage as inconclusive and argued that the investigation was biased from the start. Despite the legal posturing, investigators continued to focus on Jake. His calm demeanor, once seen as a sign of innocence, now seemed calculated. And while he maintained his story, the gaps in his alibi became impossible to ignore. If he hadn't dropped Sarah off at home, as the footage suggested, then where had he taken her? And why was he so determined to stick to a story that didn't hold up? As the tension in Briarwood reached a boiling point, investigators worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. They revisited the diner, questioning employees and customers who had been there that night. A waitress recalled Jake and Sarah's argument, describing how Sarah seemed upset and distracted. Another patron mentioned seeing Jake leave the diner alone, though they couldn't be sure of the time. Meanwhile, Mark Johnson remained under surveillance. While his story about being hired raised suspicions, investigators struggled to find concrete evidence linking him to Sarah's disappearance. His phone records showed no connection to Jake or anyone in Sarah's immediate circle, and his criminal past, while troubling, didn't include anything that suggested he was capable of orchestrating such a crime. The investigation had reached a critical juncture. On one hand, Jake's crumbling alibi and his controlling behavior towards Sarah made him the primary suspect. On the other, Mark's presence in the photos and his admission of being hired to follow Sarah hinted at a larger, more sinister plot. For Maggie Bennett, the uncertainty was unbearable. Each new revelation brought her closer to the truth, but it also deepened the pain of not knowing what had happened to her daughter. She clung to hope, even as the evidence painted an increasingly grim picture. And as the days turned into weeks, one question loomed over the entire town. Who was responsible for Sarah Bennett's disappearance, and how far would they go to keep the truth buried? The search for Sarah Bennett continued to grip the town of Briarwood. Her face was everywhere, on flyers, posters, and the nightly news. The community clung to hope, but the shadows of uncertainty loomed large. Then, on a chilly November morning, 30 miles from Briarwood, hope gave way to heartbreak. Two hikers, exploring a wooded area near the town of Ridgefield, stumbled upon something that made their blood run cold. A shallow grave, partially hidden beneath a cluster of trees. The smell was unmistakable. As they moved closer, they saw the edge of a shoe sticking out from the earth. Their frantic 911 call brought a swarm of law enforcement to the scene. Investigators worked carefully to unearth the body, and within hours the news that everyone had dreaded was confirmed. It was Sarah. The vibrant young woman whose disappearance had shaken Briarwood was now at the center of a homicide investigation. The autopsy revealed the horrifying details. Sarah had been strangled, her death ruled asphyxiation. There were signs of a struggle, defensive wounds on her hands, bruises on her wrists and arms. She had fought to the very end. For Maggie Bennett, the confirmation of her daughter's fate was a blow that words couldn't capture. The reality of losing Sarah in such a brutal way left her devastated, but it also fueled her determination to find justice. The discovery of Sarah's body shifted the investigation into overdrive. Forensic teams scoured the burial site for evidence, and it didn't take long for a significant clue to emerge: tire tracks in the dirt. The pattern was distinctive, matching the brand and model of tires on Jake Miller's truck. When confronted with this evidence, Jake's demeanor shifted. Gone was the calm, confident young man who had insisted on his innocence. He became defensive, stumbling over his words as he attempted to explain. "I've been out there before," he said. "It's a hunting spot. I must have driven through there weeks ago." But investigators weren't buying it. The tracks were fresh, and Jake's presence at the site was no coincidence. As they pressed him further, he continued to deny any involvement, even as the evidence mounted against him. The focus on Jake intensified, but he wasn't the only person under scrutiny. Forensic analysis of Sarah's belongings found near the burial site revealed another startling clue: fingerprints belonging to Mark Johnson. This connection reignited suspicions about the 35-year-old mechanic, whose vague story about being hired to follow Sarah had already raised eyebrows. Mark was brought back in for questioning, and this time investigators didn't hold back. Faced with the evidence, he cracked. What he revealed would shock the entire town. "Jake hired me," Mark confessed, his voice shaking. He said Sarah was pulling away from him, that she wasn't as committed to their relationship. He wanted me to scare her, to make her see that she needed him. According to Mark, the plan was simple: follow Sarah, send her anonymous texts, and create the illusion that she was being watched. Jake believed this would make Sarah turn to him for protection, solidifying their relationship. But on the night Sarah vanished, things spiraled out of control. Mark recounted how Jake had called him in a panic, saying that Sarah was threatening to leave him for good. Jake begged Mark to intervene, promising him more money if he could convince Sarah to stay. Mark agreed, meeting Jake and Sarah at a remote location outside of town. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," Mark insisted. "I just wanted to scare her, but she fought back. She tried to run, and I didn't know what else to do." His voice broke as he described the moment he grabbed Sarah, his hands tightening around her neck. "It happened so fast," he said. "One second she was yelling, and the next, she was gone." Mark claimed that Jake was there the entire time, frozen in shock. After Sarah's death, the two men panicked, scrambling to cover their tracks. Mark dug the shallow grave while Jake cleaned the scene, wiping down the car and disposing of Sarah's phone. They thought they had erased any evidence, but the forensic team's meticulous work proved otherwise. Mark's confession painted a shocking picture of manipulation, betrayal, and a young woman caught in a web of control. But his version of events also raised questions. Was Jake truly as passive as Mark described, or was he the mastermind behind it all? As investigators pieced together the timeline, Jake's parents fought to shield their son from the growing storm. Their high-profile legal team worked tirelessly to discredit Mark's testimony, portraying him as an unreliable criminal who had acted alone. They argued that Jake's only mistake was trusting the wrong person, insisting that he had no knowledge of Mark's true intentions. But for Maggie Bennett, the details didn't matter. All she cared about was holding the people responsible for her daughter's death accountable. She attended every hearing, her presence a constant reminder of the life that had been stolen. The betrayal was twofold. Jake, the boy she had welcomed into her home, had not only hurt Sarah, but had orchestrated a plan that ended in her death. And Mark, a stranger with no connection to Sarah, had become the instrument of Jake's twisted scheme. The discovery of Sarah's body and Mark's confession brought the investigation to a pivotal moment. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was one of unimaginable cruelty and selfishness. For Maggie, the fight for justice had only just begun. And for Briarwood, the realization that such darkness could exist within their community was a wound that would never fully heal. Jake Miller was found guilty of second-degree murder. The jury concluded that while he had not directly killed Sarah, his actions and decisions had led to her death. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Mark Johnson, whose direct involvement in Sarah's murder left little room for doubt, was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Maggie and the rest of Briarwood, the verdict brought a sense of closure, but it was a hollow victory. No sentence could ever bring Sarah back. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more true crime stories that uncover the hidden truths and demand answers. Together, let's shed light on the shadows and ensure that every voice is heard.